Welcome to What a Creep, the show with Margot Donahue and Sonia Mansfield talking about creeps from the past to the present.
This is your quick guide to the biggest creeps, jerks, assholes, and losers, the best of the worst.
From two nice ladies who want the world to be a little less creepy. Hi, everyone. This is Margot from What a Creep. Because of the tragedy that happened in Texas at the Travis Scott concert, I wanted to offer you an episode today of a show that I used to host called Not Fade Away. It was a music-based podcast, and in one of the episodes, we talked about The Who in Cincinnati, 1979, when 11 people died under very similar circumstances to what happened in Texas. I want to air this again because I spoke to an expert on crowd control. He really offered excellent advice on what you should do if you're ever caught in similar circumstances. And unfortunately, I think these things are going to continue to happen. And it doesn't just happen at concerts. It happens at football matches. It happens in shopping malls. It happens on the streets when there's an emergency. You just never know. You could anytime be caught up in a crowd. And I'm offering this episode just as a little bit of history for you all, and also in hopes that maybe someone listening, it'll keep you safe someday. Don't worry about What a Creep. New episode will drop this Friday. But for today, check out Not Fade Away. I recorded this a little over 3 years ago. The Who in Cincinnati, 1979.
Here's a lesson you don't get. I said, I loop the loop when I get loose. I said, ignition, ignite your night out.
We didn't find out until after the show. And Bill Kirbishley, who has a manager, his face was like slate. And he said, if you're going to do an encore, please make it brief, because something very, very serious has happened.
Thousands of people were gathered waiting to get into the show.
They all just started to push.
That's when the problem developed.
One massive wave.
The bodies appear to have died of trauma.
Those are the grim details.
When we left the concert, we're listening to the reports on the radio. That was pretty eerie.
December 3rd, 1979. 11 young people died outside Riverfront Coliseum. They had come to see a rock concert, The Who. In their efforts to get through the few doors that were open, they either suffocated or were crushed to death.
There doesn't seem to be anything we can do about last night. We just hope to hell it doesn't ever happen again.
A rock concert in the news. Thousands of young people had gathered hours early to get into Riverfront Coliseum in Cincinnati, Ohio. The attraction was the British rock band, The Who. Suddenly, one pair of doors to the Coliseum was broken open, and the waiting throng rushed inside, eager to get the best possible seats. In the stampede, 11 people were killed, 8 others seriously injured. Rock music fans everywhere were shocked. Observers blamed the tragedy on several factors. Most of the seats, 80%, were general admission. That meant the first fans into the Coliseum would get the best places, and that encouraged the rush. Also, many of the kids had been waiting hours to get in. Some had been drinking or using drugs. The concert went on as planned, but the members of The Who were badly shaken.
If it had happened inside the hall, I don't think I would ever play again. There is a kind of a football game, boxing match feeling to a rock concert, and it's what guys seem to get off on. You know, they like this high-energy sort of event.
The Who asked authorities to help make future rock concerts safe. And later this week, their concert in Buffalo, New York was. Unlike Cincinnati, all Buffalo seats were reserved. I'm Christopher Glenn with a rock tragedy in the news.
Hello and welcome back to the Not Fade Away podcast. Today we have the first installment of the Concerts Gone Wrong series.
This tragedy is set in 1979 in Cincinnati and took the lives of 11 young people. It brought to light the dangers of festival seating and crowd control that we are still seeing as troublesome to this day. I am your host, Margot D. This is episode 4. Thanks so much for dropping by. Follow our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Fadeaway Podcast. And for comments and suggestions, email me, Margot D, at notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. This is the show that pays homage to people and events in the music world that will never be forgotten. In this episode, I am helped by someone who was key to the events that evening, Monday, December 3rd, 1979, in Cincinnati, Paul Wertheimer, founder and principal of Crowd Management Strategies. Say hello to everyone, Paul.
My name is Paul Wertheimer. In 1979, I was the public information officer for the city of Cincinnati.
Plus, I've enlisted a few of my favorite podcasting pals to help me bring some of these key anecdotes to light. Let's get started, shall we?
Weather today in the greater Cincinnati area.
I love you so badly, I could...
They're solid plastic, so don't settle for imitation.
But the senator, while insisting he was not intoxicated, could not explain his nudity.
Baby, if you've ever wondered whatever became of me. I'm living on the air in Cincinnati, WKRP.
Cincinnati was founded in 1778 and is the third largest city in Ohio with a population just over 250,000. In the 19th century, with its access to the Ohio River and steamboats being a main way to transfer goods, Cincinnati was a booming town, rivaling other popular cities on the East Coast, including New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Also in the 19th century, it was an abolitionist hotbed with several underground railroads operating to move slaves from the South up to the Northern Territories. Eventually, Cincinnati fell behind in popularity to coastal cities, but still attracted a large number of European immigrants. Germans in particular were infatuated with the area, and the city is proud of its Germanic roots and its influence on food, architecture, and the culture of the area. When I asked some of my friends from the podcast we listened to Facebook page what was most notable about Cincinnati, which is nicknamed the Queen City, by the way, this is what I heard. Cincinnati chili, a.k.a. Skyline chili, which has a Greek influence using spaghetti and hot dogs. The Children's Hospital. The fact they had the first professional baseball team, the Cincinnati Stockings, which later became the Cincinnati Reds. Fountain Square. Grater's Ice Cream. The Cincinnati Zoo. Finley's Fish Market. It's the birthplace of Neil Armstrong, Steven Spielberg, 5 U.S. presidents, Doris Day, and Charles Manson. Their Oktoberfest is the second largest in the world after Munich. And Jerry Springer served as mayor for 1 year in 1977. Yes, that Jerry Springer. The Riverfront Coliseum opened in 1975 and was created to attract a National Hockey League team. It was an indoor arena located next to a Riverfront Stadium, which was an outdoor arena that housed the national football and baseball teams for the city. Cincinnati paid for the elaborate sky bridges that connected the Coliseum concourse to street level. The concrete right outside the Coliseum doors was considered city property. This will be important to remember later on. The arena never attracted an NHL team, but it turned out to be an excellent venue for rock concerts. In the 1970s, rock music went from clubs to giant arenas and made tons of money for all concerned, including musicians, the record companies, and the venues. The cities which held them enjoyed having thousands of young people show up to spend money before and after the show on food and drinks. And some of the top acts of the time include Paul McCartney, Elton John, Fleetwood Mac, Led Zeppelin, and The Who. There were almost immediately problems with safety at the Coliseum, and the owners and management were accused by police of being uncooperative in emergency situations. Emergency exits and doors were often locked during performances, as the owners wanted to keep a tight rein on who came and went from the arena. The 18,000-seat Coliseum typically sold 4,000 tickets with assigned seating per show, and the rest of the 14,000 were sold as festival seating or general admission. The thinking being that if you showed up early enough, you may very well find yourself in the front row. But But oftentimes there was so much competition to get there that people wound up crowding up the aisles and creating a potential hazard should there have been an emergency. The police claim that they were rebuffed several times trying to work with management at the Coliseum. Many concerned citizens wrote to the city council between 1976 to 1979 complaining about the deplorable conditions and a rude staff not interested or versed in crowd safety. One such person was Richard Klopp. He wrote several letters at the time, including this one.
June 1976. Dear Sir, since last December I have enjoyed the dubious honor of attending 2 concerts by your firm at the Riverfront Coliseum. In both cases, the personal safety of myself and my fiancée was jeopardized, while in addition our aesthetic enjoyment of the show was diminished because of the deplorable conditions there. The 2 concerts I have attended, The Who and Paul McCartney, were both sold out on a festival seating or general admission basis. What this means for a promoter is money. For the concert goer who pays $7 or $8 per ticket, this means he'll have to sit in the aisles or on the floor, blocking the exits, getting walked over or stepped on by others, and jeopardizing his safety and the safety of others. If a fire or general panic broke out, many, many people would be trampled to death. This kind of deplorable, let alone dangerous management cannot be tolerated. At the Paul McCartney concert, for example, when the doors were finally opened, a half hour late, the mass of people pressed forward, literally crushing those by the doors and forcing others into any and all available space. This is what happens when tickets are sold on a festival basis, and it is no festival. Respectfully yours, Richard Klopp.
Only one person on the city council ever wrote him back with concern. Jerry Springer. Yes, that Jerry Springer. He alone offered to look into the situation, but was insulted by management who told him he had no expertise in crowd control, and they would rather have the city focus on the problems of public urination that occurred in the concrete out front, the part that's owned by the city. As far as the Coliseum management was concerned, they didn't need the help, advice, or guidance of city officials, the police, or the fire department. They were making money, and since nothing major had gone awry, they were going to continue with business as usual. Paul Wertheimer was at one of those meetings in the summer of 1979.
I can remember, as a representative of the city manager's office, of going to an intergovernmental affairs city council meeting and listening to the police department plea with city council to give them more authority over the crowd control outside the Coliseum, and to demand that the Coliseum take more responsibility for the crowd control of their of the rock fans they invite there. And I remember, too, that a representative, the president of the Coliseum, was there, and he used an argument that's still used today by the industry, that they can't afford to do it, that it's costing them too much money. And the Coliseum won the day. That was the summer of 1979.
According to a Rolling Stone article written a month after the disaster, on August 8th, 1976, a concert security guard anonymously told the press the venue was regularly overselling tickets and had 20,000 people crammed in an arena at any time. This was a place, by the way, that was supposed to hold only 18,000 people. An editorial in the Cincinnati Enquirer read, "There is no reason to justify a ticket-selling procedure that encourages early congregation on the plaza. Experience has been shown they are an open invitation to trouble." A task force was organized to set things straight, which included 3 team members from the Coliseum and 4 others from the local government. A city report recommended reserved seating, but was ignored. So let's meet our band right now for this particular episode. This is what they would have sounded like live at that time. The Who formed in 1964 with Pete Townsend on guitar, Roger Daltrey on vocals, Keith Moon on drums, and John Entwistle on bass. In June of 1964, Townsend, ever the temperamental one, accidentally cracked the head of his guitar when it hit the ceiling of a basement club during a performance. When the audience laughed at this, he became enraged and broke his guitar into pieces. He angrily picked up another one to finish the show. The following week, the audience came back keen on seeing more destruction. Moon obliged by knocking his drum kit over. From then on, they became a band known to be so powerful, they would usually end up destroying something on stage during one of their live shows. They gained such an incredible reputation that they were quickly signed to the American Decca Records and promptly had a hit with the Kinks-inspired I Can't Explain. Other soon-to-be classic songs include Substitute and My Generation. Now, since I might create an episode about Keith Moon one day, I'm just going to skip ahead of all this Who stuff from the 60s and early 70s for now, and instead just give you this quick overview of the band. They have sold over 100 million copies of their music. They were considered kings of the mod movement, which was a sexier counterpart to the American hippie counterculture. Pete Townsend invented the rock opera with Tommy, and each original member is revered for their musicianship. So now we're going to fast forward to 1978. The band is recording Who Are You, and they're in a bit of turmoil. First, the Rolling Stones' manager, Alan Klein, tried to buy out their publishing rights, which infuriated Townsend. And then, Keith Moon's drinking began to affect his work. He was famous for being Looney Moon, who liked to destroy hotel rooms, but his alcoholism now affected his timing. He was not the great drummer he used to be, and the band considered firing him, but he promised to clean up. On August 18th that year, Who Are You was released and became a smash hit. On September 7th, Moon took 32 clometazole tablets, which had been prescribed to help him with his alcohol withdrawal. He died later that day. He was 32 years old. Kenny Jones of the Small Faces joined the band on their tour to support the record in May 1979. The rest of the Who really never considered quitting. They were a live touring band, and their fans depended on seeing them when they were on the road, and they expected to get on the road as soon as they could. Prior to arriving in Cincinnati on December 3rd, the band had played 11 dates in New York, plus Detroit and Pittsburgh, without any major incidents. Now, let's get to that day, December 3rd, 1979. At 3 p.m., people began arriving at the Coliseum, fully ready to wait several hours in the frigid weather to get their coveted spot up front. There were already about 200 to 300 people there alternately standing around and just doing some light calisthenics to warm up. Lieutenant Dale Mankhouse decided to bring in 14 officers to arrive at 3 p.m. instead of the usual 4 p.m. to meet the anticipated crowd. It was in the 30s that day, and with the wind coming across the Ohio River, it felt much chillier. But the folks gathered around were in really good spirits. This was an event the whole area was excited about, even all the way out into Kentucky. People have been talking about it for weeks beforehand.
In the weeks prior to the concert, my friends and I listened to every Who record. In order to get good seats, you had to arrive early, so we got there at like 5 o'clock. There was a large group of folks there already, so we positioned ourselves at the edge of the crowd. It was just a happy group of people waiting for the doors to open. Dan Smith.
So the entrance to the stadium resembled a V-shaped prow of a ship. And once again, the concrete in front of the stadium was the responsibility of the city and the local police. The Coliseum inside had their own security. So Mankhouse instituted 5 checkpoints. And in order to get to the doors, meaning on the concrete outside, you needed to show a ticket and not have any bottles or cans on you. Folks dressed, by the way, in several light layers to fight the cold, but most expected to shed some of that gear during the show when they were inside enjoying the band. Around 5 p.m., a rumor went out that the doors would open early at 6:30 instead of 7. It was quickly becoming very, very crowded. There were now almost 1,000 people waiting outside, and the doors would not be open for at least another 90 minutes. No one wanted to lose their spot in line because with the festival seating, everyone believed they alone had a shot at getting to the front row, but you had to be in line and you had to be first to get there. So the crowd started swelling quickly. and people were getting jammed very close together. Concert goer Deborah Shoemate was decked out in long johns, jeans, flannel shirt, a scarf, and a down jacket. It kept her warm when she first arrived that afternoon, but as the crowd started to swell and the sun went down, she actually felt herself getting uncomfortably hot, specifically around her neck. She tried to loosen her scarf when she realized she could not move her arms. They were pinned at her sides. Trying to gain some space, she attempted to plant her feet wider, but her legs were stuck together as well. She was now trapped in the crowd, completely standing upright. At this time, it's 5:30, and most people expected to be stuck like this for the next hour at least. Deborah looked for her younger sister, who was shivering in her shearling jacket. The heat from the crowd was suffocating. Deborah's ex-Marine husband helped her sister take off her jacket, which was then flown over the crowd and disappeared. So at this point, those observing from a distance thought things looked very orderly. No pushing or shoving, no loud voices. But some recalled later there were also no joyful sounds, like singing or laughing. They might as well have been standing in line ready to check out a book from the library with all the enthusiasm that they showed. The pressure of the bodies pressed so closely together muffled any sounds that could have come from that crowd. They needed to actually save their energy, as breathing was becoming more difficult by the minute, and it was also getting uncomfortably hot.
The crowd would move around, which would release all the heat and create this ball of steam that would puff out into the crowd. A few people passed out standing up. Dan Smith.
The Who arrived in Cincinnati at around noon on December 3rd after a successful series of gigs on the East Coast. Altogether, 18,348 tickets were sold. Of those, only 3,578 were for reserved seating. The rest were general admission, festival seating. The tickets cost $10 to $11 at the box office and sold out in 90 minutes, but scalpers were charging up to $100 per ticket that night. That is the equivalent of $350 in today's money. But for a lot of people, it was going to be the only time to see the band in Cincinnati, and some people were willing to pay that price gleefully. The band's take-home pay, after all the debts were covered, would be $100,000, which is about the equivalent of $350,000 in today's money. At 2 p.m., the band checks into the Stouffer Cincinnati Towers, which is now known as the Millennium Downtown. At 3 p.m., Daltrey and Townsend decide to check out the local mall. They gravitated towards a bookstore looking for something to read later on. The store manager, a 40-year-old woman who instantly recognized them, was impressed with how quiet and polite they were. Back in the early through mid-'70s, The Who was known as a party band that liked to wreck backstage areas just out of sheer boredom. But their main prankster Moon was gone now, and it just seemed sort of silly. They were now in their mid-30s and needed to save their energy for putting on the show. After a light supper at 6 p.m., which some crew members were nervous about and felt it was just a little bit too late, the band finally takes off from the hotel in separate limousines to go to the Coliseum. Meanwhile, the crowd is now swaying. People are beginning to pass out and fall over. They're being separated from their friends and family and losing their shoes and jackets in the process.
Got so large so quickly that we really needed to get people inside the facility as quickly as possible. At 6:30, when the doors didn't open, I started contacting the decision makers inside to find out why they hadn't opened the doors and when they would open. I was told they couldn't open them until the Who did their sound check. Their response was they were limited in the number of ticket takers and they couldn't use other people at the doors for fear of violating union contracts, and they would do the best they could. Major Dale Minkhouse.
So it's 6:30 now, and the band finally has their sound check 30 minutes late. The crowd hears the music and gets excited. They think the show is about to start soon, but the doors could not be opened until the band was done rehearsing. This seems to be the moment when most people felt it all got out of control.
It was so tight you couldn't look down to see your feet. I was actually being carried forward with the flow of the crowd and was stuck. I could hear the music inside, and people thought the concert had started. It was getting hard to breathe, and I had to stand on my toes to get air. Diana Kubert.
Sometime between 7:05 and 7:15, the security guards began to try and open some of the doors. The problem was that the doors swung open out into the crowd. The crush of people pushing forward against the doors made it impossible to open them. They needed an incredible amount of counter pressure to open them, and the back of the crowd just kept pushing forward. Finally, a few doors managed to get open, only to find the lobby suddenly flooded with terrified and exhausted people who needed help. Each person then had to show their ticket and go through a turnstiles, which is just absurd if you think about the situation. Making every single person go through that turnstile just caused the logjam. And think about it. Everybody had to show their ticket in order to get on the concrete outside anyway. They all had a ticket. Anyway, so the doors get closed again to clear out the lobby. Now, this happens for the next hour or so, opening and closing the doors to an increasingly frantic mob. Towards the south side of the Coliseum, a set of glass doors burst under the pressure. People crawled through the broken glass with no other option than to move forward. Getting inside at this point meant safety. After 90 minutes of suffering, they were willing to risk cutting themselves to break free of the crush of people.
All of a sudden, my body started to go forward with the crowd. I was 5 feet from the doorway. I could feel something down on the ground. My body was pushing forward, but I could feel something under my feet that caused me to completely fall forward and land on the concrete. When I was laying there, I remember seeing people go over the top and going in through the doors. I could feel their shoes, and they were grinding up against the bones of my legs. Then someone fell on my head. That was the scariest moment because I couldn't breathe. I was frantically jerking my head, trying to get air. I began to wonder if I was ever going to get out of there. I had no shoes on. My face was pretty bloody. My legs were in pretty bad shape. Diana Kubert.
During all of this, it's really important to remember that people really tried to help one another. If someone felt faint, a person would help them up. There really was no mob mentality. The people stuck in the middle just wanted to get out so they can go and get some help for their friends. This is a recollection from an unnamed concertgoer she gave to the police while being treated at the hospital later on.
They opened the door and everyone started pushing forward. Then people started pushing backward and it was getting hot and people started to pass out. And then they were falling on the ground and we were trying to pick them up. And I got pushed to the ground and a guy told me to hold on to his neck. Then he said, "I'm sorry, I can't hold you anymore. There's nothing I can do." And I just started praying to God as loud as I could. People around me kept saying, "Pray louder, pray louder." And I did. All of a sudden, a couple of people cleared away from me.
As the doors were alternately opening and closing to the lobby, it became chaos as arms and legs became tangled trying to get through the turnstiles. At this point, security guards had to use their medic skills and administer CPR on people passed out on the already crowded floors.
About 20 feet back from the door, we did find a female victim. Her skin was blue. I tried to take her to the first aid station. I pushed on the door and it was locked. I pounded on the door and a private security guard opened the door. I said, "Let us in. We have a bad one." He said, "I can't. There's no room." And at that point, he opened the door and literally every square foot of floor space had a body. And it wasn't until that point that I understood how big this event had become. We called every life squad and every ambulance in the city, every resource in the city available at that point in time. There were bodies laying everywhere, some that were dead and many more that were injured. There was just so much havoc at the time. Major Dale Minkhouse.
Now, this is kind of funny to think about, but that night, half the people that attended the show literally had no idea what was going on. They just simply walked through another entrance of the building and just took their seats. And some of those that did know what was going on, they were just in shock. Once they went inside, a lot of them just took their tickets, went to their seats, and sat down and then tried to enjoy the show. In fact, Dan Smith recorded it for posterity. Some people tried to get help from the cops located inside the Coliseum. Now, let's remember, there are probably a lot of police officers inside that didn't know what was going on outside as well, but this is something that happened that night.
I told him, "What are you doing? People are getting trampled up there."
The officer looks me over and says, "What do you do for a living?" Caught up in the absurdity, I answered, "Working on a PhD in language." The officer replied, "Well, you just used a dangling participle." I could only think to reply, "I think I know more about language than you do." The policeman smiles at me and says, "Well, then don't tell me how to do my job." I yelled, "People are getting hurt!" And he just said to me, "Well, we can't do anything." I stormed off and eventually found my wife. Richard Klopp.
Quadrophenia, the major musical statement about an angry generation, is now a motion picture for every generation. Quadrophenia, for everyone.
The Who had not been told that there was any issue going on and began their show with a 15-minute trailer for their upcoming movie, Quadrophenia. It's notable for being the screen debut of Sting and featuring a whole slew of motorbikes. The trailer features scenes of nihilism that excited some of the audience, but made others who had just survived the horror outside very uneasy. They had seen enough chaos for one lifetime, thank you very much. Scene after scene seemed to feature a bunch of angry white people shouting at each other and rebelling against everything and anything.
Yeah, I'll show you what you can do with your job, and all that other rubbish you can stuff right up your ass. Can you see the real me? Can you see the real me?
Quadrophenia, The Who's triumphant answer to indifference. The movie the music's been waiting for.
Outside the Coliseum, every available first responder in the area was on duty trying to save lives, but the number of those affected was staggering. Diana Kubert's brother managed to save her from the crowd and carried her to an ambulance. There is a news clip of Diana looking ragged and frightened. It's one of the more famous video images from that night.
Right away, they had to cut all of my clothes off because my body had swollen up so much. I was pretty hysterical and also thankful I was breathing, that I was alive. I didn't know anyone had died until I was at the hospital. Then I realized what I had tripped up on, you know? At the time, I knew it was something big on the ground, but I never dreamed it was a body laying there. They tried to blame the crowd. A bunch of young people on drugs caused this to happen, and it wasn't true at all. Diana Kubert.
So this went on for hours while the Who were on stage. At 9:15, Paul Wertheimer of the Cincinnati Public Information Office arrived at the Coliseum. It was his job to relay information to the media.
I arrived at the Coliseum around 9:15. That was after the tragedy was known, but they were still trying to figure out what was going on at that time. I was homesick that day, and I was watching the TV, and there was a news flash bulletin that 7 or 8 people had died at the Coliseum. So being the city manager, the public information officer, I just got dressed and went down there, figuring I might be able to help. And when I got there, it was a kind of a surreal situation with clothing and shoes piled up everywhere. Kind of reminded me of a concentration camp situation. And there were still paramedics working or assisting people. There was a certain amount of chaos. I found the mayor, J. Kenneth Blackwell. It was his first couple of days as mayor. And I found the assistant city manager, and then the fire chief came by. And everybody was trying to figure out what happened. Nobody... At that time, around 9:15, and the doors were supposed to open, if I may say, at 6 o'clock, at 6:30. Excuse me, the doors were supposed to open at 6:30, but they didn't because the band, the Who, was late. They hadn't done their sound check, so they wouldn't let anyone in until they were done with their sound check. And the first bodies were discovered around 7:50 or so. And most of them were known by 8 o'clock. So I came down there, and everyone's still trying to figure out if it was bad drugs in the crowd, if there was a gas leak. We were so naive, we had no idea what happened. And then we got the first responders started telling us heart attacks, asphyxia appeared to be the problem, and they recognized crowd crush had occurred. Then the decision was, do we cancel the concert or not? And the decision was made not to do that.
When The Who ended their performance, their tour manager told them to play one quick encore. He had some very bad news to relay afterwards. In total, 11 people died and dozens were injured in the span of just a few hours. So the question became, how did this happen? Now, in the immediate aftermath, believe it or not, many members of the press blamed the victims for being self-indulgent drug addicts who got what was coming to them. Once again, Paul Wertheimer.
Nightmarish, horrible, out of control, deadly situation, where many people were asphyxiated standing up. The crush was so bad. You couldn't even, and if you've been in a crowd where you lose control of your own ability to move, you know what that's like when you can't lift your arms, or you're lifted off the ground by the pressure of people around you who just push you up in the crowd like a cork. You know what that's like, but nobody cared. And it was, I was going to say it's hard to believe, but back then, we are in 2017, and music fans and rock fans are still mistreated. But there was a kind of neglect as far as the venue was in the arena about the safety of young people outside. And rock and roll in 1979 was not established as part of the general American culture as it is today. So if bad things happened at concerts, the first thing to do was to blame the victims, or blame the fans. Sometimes they caused the problems too, but it was always just default blame the victims. So they got mistreated often.
Walter Cronkite, revered news anchor for the CBS Evening News, gave a blistering speech the following evening, December 4th, blaming the audiences at rock concerts and repeating the mantra that a crazy stampede killed reckless people who were certainly asking for it.
Man, I was greatly disturbed by the WCPO TV's depiction of us as a drug-crazed mob. There were too many people and just 2 doors open. It was an incredible bottleneck. It was a slow squeeze, not a stampede. I was stuck in it for 45 minutes. I went down twice and I wasn't sure that I would make it. I saw guys with blue lips. They couldn't get oxygen. I saw, I think, 4 ticket takers after I walked over all the shoes to get in. I couldn't keep my feet on the ground the whole time. I kept my arms in front of my chest to keep from getting crushed. People were climbing up on other people's shoulders. Man, people went berserk and started swinging their elbows. That was the only blood. There was no group panic. After I saw the dead people, it sunk in. Dead. Just dead. It pissed me off to see Uncle Walter Cronkite blaming us for this. Mark Helmkamp.
Now, one thing I really want to impart on all of you listening to this show, wherever you are in the world, whatever happened that night, you cannot label it a stampede. It is continually described as such to this day, even in the media in Cincinnati. But I want you to hear from Paul Wertheimer again, as he is a revered crowd security expert with intimate knowledge of what actually happened that night.
Unfortunately, the media always uses the stampede. Seldom are there stampedes. Could have been a stampede certainly in Las Vegas, but there was no stampede in Cincinnati because, first of all, you have to be able to run somewhere or move quickly. A stampede is generally what we've seen on Westerns all the time. Animals running or people running away from a perceived danger. That's what a stampede from a perceived danger. What you had in Cincinnati was a crowd craze. A craze is just the opposite, running towards something of perceived value. That's why a craze is when you see people try to get close to the artist on stage, to try to touch a celebrity, to grab a piece of clothing, to grab some souvenir, and competing against someone else in a forward motion. So it's very simple. And most disasters are generally crowd crazes. They don't have to be, but most of them deal with moving towards something of perceived value, not trying to get away. However, there are, there are bona fide stampedes.
So doing research for this episode, I, of course, go to the Google machine and I hit Google Images, searching for images about the Who in Cincinnati. If you do the same, you will find literally hundreds of black and white images of piles of shoes and jackets. I wanted to know what the deal was. So, of course, I asked Paul.
On the night of December 3rd, 1979, out in front of Coliseum, the temperature was approximately 36 degrees without a wind chill factor. Now, remember, the Coliseum was straddled the riverfront of the Ohio River. And there was a brisk wind coming from the south that hit the fans who were outdoors, had been outdoors forever. So everybody is dressed up, of course. It's December, and it's chilly. But when you're caught in a crowd crush that's so large, it could be 8,000 to 10,000 people, you can lose your shoes. They just get ripped off of you. And you can either you take your jackets off or your coat while you can, or they get twisted and pulled and pushed and torn off you. Seeing shoes and clothing after a crowd crush is common worldwide. This is what happens. And that's why one of my crowd safety recommendations in the crowd is always wear proper shoes. Flip-flops, loafers, even high heels, things that can come off easy are not really the best shoes to wear under certain circumstances. But your shoes just get ripped right off of you, your jackets and clothing and hat and purse and whatever else, your watch, anything, your glasses, in this swirling, crushing, surging kind of vomiting kind of situation where humans are thrust, the force is so great, you're just kind of torn apart.
Roger Daltrey became the main spokesperson for The Who, and he looked shocked at their first press conference that took place the day after the tragedy.
The band is shattered. We just feel helpless at the moment. There doesn't seem to be anything we can do about last night. We just hope to hell it doesn't ever happen again.
What do you think caused that mess in Cincinnati? Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, from what we didn't say anything last night to anybody because we didn't know any facts. I feel that it seems that there are only 3 entrances for people to get into the hall, and it just obviously inadequate. And when you get 4,000 or 5,000 people queuing up to get in, and people are falling down in the front, people at the back don't know. It's kind of domino effect. They all start going over. I think that's probably the main reason.
I think it was the type of festival seating.
No, this is a common thing in rock and roll. I don't know whose idea it is. You must understand that we're artists. All that side of it is usually the decisions there are taken by the city hall or the promoter. I don't know. I think it's a city, actually. And it's a common thing in rock and roll. We've played the Silverdome in Detroit and filled it with 76,000 people, festival seating, and nobody came out with a bruise. So I don't really feel that is the problem. I really don't. And the night before in Pittsburgh, same seating, great crowd. It looks like a mess when you're looking at it, but those kids are just boisterous. They're bouncing about,
When did you hear about what happened last night? What was your first inclination of what had taken place?
We finished our act on Won't Get Fooled Again, and we came off and we were asked to do a short encore because they had problems. And by the look on my manager's face, I knew something was serious had happened. But I mean, I thought it was drug overdose or something, you know. And then when we did a very short encore, and we came off and he told us. I mean, we didn't know prior to the show at all.
2 weeks later, everyone met at City Hall and tried to determine what went wrong that day. Folks who survived the crowd crush took to the podiums to decry how they were being treated in the media.
Calling what happened at the Coliseum that night a stampede is a distortion of the facts. A stampede implies a sudden rush. This did not happen. Instead, there was a slow, inescapable, and constantly more dangerous rush that built steadily for over an hour. After I attempted to exhort people to back up, several people told me that all rock concerts are like this. I found this to be personally appalling, that such a dangerous situation had become to be considered normal. The rock industry has either been incapable or unwilling to provide assurance to its paying customers that they can expect their personal safety is included in the price of a ticket. Michael Kanzer.
It looked like they attempted to open more doors, but the crowd was so tightly packed it was useless. I was maybe like 15 rows of people back staring at this door, and it hung like about 6 inches open, and they finally sprung it open, and that's all I remember till I got inside. I could see people smashed up against the doors that weren't open. I had a hold of my girlfriend, and my buddy grabbed me by the shoulders, and I took him by the hand, and we started to make our way through the turnstiles. Well, in that 10 or 15 seconds it took us to get our act together, we were now inside between the doors and the turnstiles, and the door was a frenzy, and they're still trying to take tickets. God, it was insane. I was like 3 abreast in this goddamn turnstile, which was only 18 inches wide. People were getting hurled in and shoved through the turnstiles, and the ticket takers were still saying, "Hey, where's your ticket?" There was continuous pushing till like 7, and then the doors opened shortly after that. God, there was this one girl. It must have been like 20 minutes before the doors opened, and all of a sudden, I feel a tug on my arm. It's this girl, and her head was at my waist, and she said, "Excuse me, my feet are back there somewhere." She was horizontal. I went back out to look for my friends. I saw, and this after the show started, which was about 8:20, I saw the same scene. It was still crazy. It was crazier between the outside doors and the turnstiles than it was outside, because by then people were really going for broke. I found my friend Bill, and he said he saw people going over the tops of the doors. He saw bodies piled in front of the door, and people were going over them and around them any way they could. At about 9, I saw more waves of people. I looked outside, and I saw what must have been $1,000 worth of personal articles just strewn everywhere. These terrible piles of shoes trapped in that chain link fencing behind the turnstiles. I wonder about the kinds of injuries that weren't reported. Phil Sheridan.
In February 1980, just 2 months after the tragedy, the very popular sitcom WKRP in Cincinnati created a whole episode about the event. In it, the rock station had given tickets of the Who concert to their fans, and all of the DJs went to the show, including Mr. Carlson, who was kind of older at a square and normally didn't like rock and roll. Now, once again, let's remember this. In real life, most people that attended that show had no idea what was going on. They didn't find out anything was wrong until they left the building and encountered all of the first responders and news crews. Here is a clip of Mr. Carlson, the station owner, talking about his experience at the concert the following morning. This is when he learns what happened from his staff.
Right into mine.
Oh, I'm sorry about that, Venus. You know, I got a confession to make. I went to that rock concert last night thinking I was going to hate it, and I ended up having the best time.
Mr. Carlson.
Not now, Jennifer. I'm on a roll. Whatever it is, I'm on it. What's everybody got such a long face for?
You didn't listen to our station this morning, did you?
No.
Mr. Carlson, I don't know how to tell you this. 11 kids lost their lives last night at that concert.
What are you talking about, Travis? Is this some kind of bad joke?
Sir, I wish it were.
Well, I was there. I didn't see anything.
None of us did.
It happened before the concert started, Mr. Carlson. There was this large crowd outside the Coliseum. They'd been waiting there for hours and hours. It was very cold.
Somebody inside decided to open some doors?
There was some reserved seating. Mostly general admission. That's what they call festival seating.
No, that's what they call a stampede.
And that's what happened. The Who didn't even know what had come down until after the show.
Excuse me. I don't feel so good.
So after that hearing in December, the city of Cincinnati enacted a ban on all festival seating of any concerts or performances in the area. And how did the Who feel? They left very quickly after the event and never returned. That's right, the Who never returned to Cincinnati, and they speak very rarely about it, if at all, these days. A few weeks after the incident, Pete Townsend gave an impassioned interview to a Detroit radio station. He was at times angry, upset, self-pitying, defiant, and sincere in describing how they were all just processing this tragedy. He was adamant, however, they were not quitting the touring life.
I was down for a little while, but I feel happy now. But I don't care. I don't give a shit. I really want to rock. I'm not worried about my neurosis or problems anymore. I just want to work and be happy. We didn't know anything about the accident, but everything in my life tells me to stop. My 2 little girls, my brain, body, everything tells me to stop. I'm not going to stop. I just don't care, really. I really don't care what happens anymore. I really have gone blind. I mean, I've done the rock and roll thing, and I'm paying, and I'm paying, and I'm paying. I do not want to stop now. I don't even care anymore. I'm so upset for the kids that died in Cincinnati, and their folks and friends and families and all that, but The Who isn't the only band that can cause a stampede. Led Zeppelin can do it. Yes can do it. Genesis can do it. In fact, in Cincinnati, all those bands did it before we even arrived there. Pete Townsend.
The full list of those killed that day are as follows. Walter Adams, Jr., 22. Peter Bowes, 18. Connie Sue Burns, 21. Jacqueline Eckerl, 15. David Heck, 19. David had escaped the melee for a bit, only to go back to save people and got crushed in the crowd. Teva Ray Ladd, 27. She left behind a husband and 2 children. Karen Morrison, 15. Stephen Preston, 19. Philip Snyder, 20. Brian Wagner, 17. And James Wormuth, 21. Now, there were, of course, several lawsuits at the time, but all were settled out of court, and no one has ever taken responsibility for the events of that evening. For over 3 decades now, the families left behind would visit the site where the tragedy took place, feeling alone in their grief. I wish I could tell you that rock concerts became safe after that, but we will find on the next few episodes, these atrocities still unfortunately happen. One of the ones I may very well talk about in a future episode in more detail would be the crowd crush that took place on June 30th, 2000 at a Pearl Jam concert in Denmark that ultimately left 9 dead under very similar circumstances. Founded in 1971 as the Sound Festival, the Roskilde Festival had a long reputation for being one of the safer ones to attend that attracted amazing talent over the years, including Bob Dylan, David Bowie, U2, and Radiohead. At 10:30 that evening, the band hit the stage in front of 50,000 excited fans. Within an hour, the band's manager told them 8 men died between the ages of 17 and 26, all had suffocated in the mosh pit while the band performed right in front of them. A 9th victim died later at the hospital. Pearl Jam was devastated by the news and canceled their next 2 performances. On July 1st, none other than Pete Townsend had called lead singer Eddie Vedder to console him. Townsend advised Pearl Jam not to leave too soon. He also told them he regretted how he spoke to the press in the aftermath of Cincinnati, and that he spoke, and I quote, without proper consideration of the fact that the people who deserved respect were the dead and their families. On October 4th, 2014, lead singer Eddie Vedder gave this tribute to all victims of stadium violence everywhere at a concert in Cincinnati.
To the Who, I would like to dedicate this one to all the families that
have had to go on living with the reality of that event that happened all those years ago, about 35 years ago in December. So we know a little bit. It became something that we had to learn about too, and they reached out to us when we really needed it, and it's good. It's another reason why seeing everybody's positive energy here tonight in the same building. That's so much fun. So listen, Pete, Roger, and this was the last song they played.
The Who, by the way, continues to be a successful touring act every time they choose to go on the road. I myself have been to several Who farewell tours over the years and can attest to their amazing live performances. In June 2013, the Cincinnati City Council voted to overturn the ban on festival seating, provided they follow strict guidelines to maximize safety. As of this taping, there have been no reported incidents of any violations to the codes set in place. I want to take this moment to give a special shout out to some of my best resources from this episode. Paul Wertheimer, founder and principal of Crowd Management Strategies. Thank you, Paul. Wikipedia, please support them, by the way. Rock and Roll Tragedy from Rolling Stone magazine, published January 4th, 1980. And Are the Kids All Right? The book by John Grant Fuller. And before I say goodbye, I need to give a special shout out to a few friends of mine who provided voices today. They include Dana Buckler from the How Is This Movie podcast as Major Dale Menkhaus, David the producer from the Unwritable Ramp podcast as Mark Helmkamp, Nick from the Dependent Independent podcast as Phil Sheridan, Austin Beach from the Winnebago Warrior, The Tale of John Winnebay podcast as Richard Klopp, Jennifer Menges from WidelyTravel.com as Diana Kubert, Stuart Mangus from WidelyTravel.com as Pete Townsend, Neil Santrangolo of the Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks podcast as Michael Kanzer, Erin Whitehead of the Brawless podcast as our unnamed concert goer, and Sean Coco from the Childhood Remastered podcast as Dan Smith. Thanks to everyone. Thank you for listening to the Not Fade Away podcast. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you love what you hear, yay, please leave a review. It helps us so much more than you could ever know. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Fade Away Podcast. You can email us with comments or suggestions to notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to learn more about my other shows, Book vs. Movie, The Fit Bottom Girls, and the Best Neighbors podcast, just follow me at Brooklyn Fit Chick on all social media or check out my main blog, brooklynfitchick.com.
Thank you for listening to us talk about creeps. You can follow us at What a Creep Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
But don't follow us too closely.
You can email us your creepy stories at whatacreeppodcast@gmail.com.
But please keep your dick pics to yourself.